And it's the first such all-day event that's been sponsored on private property rights by a group of pro-freedom, pro-private property ownership viewpoint, and dedicated to the future of the rural communities and the culture seemingly trapped in, as I call it now, the wretched blue line. This is the first time that we've held a conference up north here rather than in Albany. And I'm happy that this location in beautiful Lake George with the breathtaking colors still holding on in some spots is able to give us some special enjoyment. I hope it doesn't rain all the while. And I really thank you for coming to the conference. And also I thank you to some of my friends who have traveled a significant distance to get here. I know what a project that is. I'd also like to formally express publicly our appreciation to the conference co-sponsors. It's very hard for groups to co-sponsor the Property Rights Conference. You can have criticism for it. But the Builders Institute, Westchester and the Mid-Hudson region came through, even though their membership is down and they've had to let people go. The Competitive Enterprise Institute contributed. Panelist group, the Guard of the Citizens for Private Property Rights, and the National Center for Public Policy Research. I think you met David Reitenauer and a few other people who come up here. These organizations have contributed to the conference in spite of very difficult economic times, and they have greatly curtailed finances. I'd also like to express my appreciation for the Great Circle Foundation's generous educational outreach grant. That has made a great impact this year on the ability of the Property Rights Conference to tell about the infringements on the culture and particularly the threats to the hunting clubs when the state buys up land. Well, early this year, my husband and I Peter and I should say, spent some time studying records of legislative hearings in the state legislature. We wanted to see the original documents from the 1800s that relate to the creation of the Adirondack Forest Preserve. This will be the beginning of my theme, the idea of protecting the Adirondacks. Our state senator, Betty Little, made it possible for the librarian to provide whatever archives that we could possibly need, and she was virtually our servant for a day, bringing out archives, telling us what might be in them, and then having them copied. We wanted to fully understand the thinking behind the decision of the legislature to require that the state pay local real estate taxes on land that it would acquire for the forest preserve. But there was far more information in there. We did indeed learn from legislative testimony in 1885 that the legislature was concerned about being fair to the local communities because the state ownership of land to restore the forests that had been recklessly clear-cut would also hamper the local economy. The state's payment of taxes was an attempt to restore balance and protect the communities. We also learned that the purpose of the Forest Preserve was not what today would be called environmentalism. It was to protect commerce. As every school child knows, the Erie Canal and the mighty Hudson linked the great harbor of New York City to shipments of goods to and from Buffalo, the link to the Great Lakes and to the entire Midwest. New York City soon outstripped every city on the East Coast, but by the late 1880s, the Erie Canal was drying up during the summer, making shipping impossible. The Hudson was running dangerously low, and the saline front, where the salt water meets the fresh water coming from the hills, was moving dangerously upstream. The summer flow in some of the streams that fed these essential waterways had decreased by 30 to 50% in the Adirondack Forest, which acted like a great reservoir and was being denuded by radical logging. The forest to the north had to be restored so the fountains of water from the Adirondacks could steadily and reliably feed these essential waterways. The forest floor had to hold the water like a great sponge in the spring and release it gradually during the summer. As you know, the forest was gradually reestablished, starting with the 681,374 acres of land that the state owned in the Adirondacks in 1885. The idea was in the background that when the forest was in good shape, it would be scientifically managed in this new science of forestry to provide commercial lumber and other goods. It was not intended to remain forever wild. The state comptroller's report to the legislature stated in 1885 that the comptroller would receive revenue from cutting trees to improve the remaining trees. Who would have ever thought that in 2009 there would be almost 3 million acres of forest preserve owned by the state in the Adirondacks? What fair-minded person of the late 19th century could possibly have envisioned a property transaction device called a conservation easement that would add another 700,000 acres of eradicated development rights to the DEC's giant repository of deeds at its Albany headquarters? And I must do an aside. I once was doing a Freedom of Information request, and I was taken to the DEC room to do some copying with the DEC official. And this room spread from where I am and all the way to the front door, and in both directions just as far. Nothing but floor-to-ceiling shelves of deeds of state-owned land for the forest preserve. It was awesome. And I am not easily awed, having grown up in practically the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. And who could have imagined that with all the development on nearly 4 million acres of land obviated by these transactions, the state would still consider it necessary that it needs a relatively new agency called the Adirondack Park Agency to restrict land use by the beleaguered local people and other landowners. But such is the case. The APA, as it is called up north, has a land use plan that restricts homes to a minimum of 42 acres per house on about half the private land, and to a little over 8 acres per house on another 37% of the private land. When wetlands and water bodies, steep slopes are added in, almost no land remains for the generous zoning on the remaining areas, which are zoned hamlet, 3.2 or 1.3 acres minimum. This situation is a far cry from the vision of the public-spirited people and the legislators who created the forest preserve and gave it constitutional protection a few years later. It should be remembered that New York State's Constitution is a different sort of document than the U.S. Constitution, which people are much more familiar with. The state constitution is a large, unwieldy collection of laws that are modified rather often, rather than a minimal outline of the structure of the government and protections of fundamental rights. In New York, the Constitution is so unwieldy that if National Grid wants to bring a power line to the isolated, once thriving village of Tupper Lake from the northwest, a constitutional amendment is required because state-owned land is so close to Route 56 that it won't allow a transmission line entering the sacrosanct forest preserve. That is why there is actually a constitutional amendment on the ballot this year to allow the construction of an ordinary power line on the ballot throughout New York State this very election day. What a far cry from the forest preserve being protected for shipping on the state's major commercially navigable waterways. What happened over the years was the state's policies affecting the Adirondacks became simply an agenda of the New York City wealthy, not the commercial interests that serve the people of the country, but the interests of the wealthy to keep the Adirondacks to themselves for their own private recreation. Nelson Rockefeller's brother Lawrence wanted to make the central Adirondacks a national park, but the local people objected, and the individuals concerned with preservation thought that the park would be too small. I have an original copy of the Adirondack National Park proposal that the late Assemblyman Glenn Harris gave me from his archives. It's not just a rumor that there was a Rockefeller plan to create a national park. When the idea of a national park was stymied, the governor appointed one of those study commissions. This called the Temporary Study Commission on the Future of the Adirondacks. The chairman was Harold Hochschild, the man behind the Adirondack Museum. The commission soon came up